and here today before this committee. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Senator Markey. Senator Nelson.
Dr. Curry wanted to respond to Senator.
Is it possible for me to respond? You basically...
I did not ask you a question.
Really? Why can't she respond, Senator?
Dr. Curry,
you impugned her integrity. I think she's entitled to.
You are welcome to respond, Dr.
I was basically called a denier that I'm denying science. Did you read my written testimony? Are you aware that the IPCC and the consensus has no explanation for the increase of ice in the Antarctic? Are you aware that they have no explanation for the fact that the rate of sea level rise from 1920 to 1950 was as large, if not larger, as it currently is? Are you aware that temperatures have been warming for more than 200 years and that in the 20th century, 40% of the warming occurred before 1950 when carbon dioxide was not a factor in the warming? Okay, and I could go on and on. Many of these issues are raised in my written testimony, and most of it is pulled from the IPCC itself. The IPCC has an explanation for, so it says, for warming during the period 1975 to 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the flat period since 2000. It doesn't have an explanation for the early century.
As I just said in my testimony, corroborated by Dr. Titley, this is the warmest year ever recorded. Last year is the warmest year ever recorded until this year. This is the warmest November ever recorded. October is the warmest October ever recorded. You do not have an answer for that, Dr. May.
Yes.
You continue to ignore the chart which Dr. Titley has over his left shoulder. He has documented for this committee the warming trend, which is inexorable, inevitable in terms of its consequences unless we take action here. That's the science you're having a hard time in responding to.
The issue
here,
is
Dr.
what is causing the warming. Is it natural variability or is it humans?
Like Galileo, he said, no, the science.
Are you aware?
The science is clear. You are depending upon something that perhaps is God-made rather than dependent upon something that is man-made, which is anthropogenic and documented by 97% of all of the scientists.
Are you saying there's no natural variability, Senator? There were alligators at the North Pole. What was that? Was that you and your SUV?
What I am saying is that this warming is something that, while it may have a variability year to year in specific parts of the planet, that the trend is straight up.
Yeah. Do you know what the Little Ice Age was, Senator?
And again, it is climate change. We had 110 inches of snow in Boston last year with measurements of water 21 degrees warmer than normal off of the coast of Massachusetts. Okay, this was an unusual event for us. The warming of the ocean intensifies the amount of precipitation when Arctic air hits that water. Now, if you want to deny that, if you want to ignore that these changes are taking place and that they're having a dramatic impact, then you are in the right place.
Do you know what the winters were like at Plymouth Rock? Do you know what the winters were like at Plymouth Rock, Senator?
Well, here is the thing.
You don't. How long has your family been in Massachusetts?
We are new arrivals, and I have to admit,
you should have been there in 1750.
The Irish weren't arriving in 1750, so I apologize for being late to the country, and I'll have to chastise my grandparents for not leaving until the economic conditions in 1902 forced them here. But that notwithstanding, there is as much consensus that man is causing climate change as there is in Galileo's original theory. And
what percentage of climate change is man causing, Senator?
Excuse me, sir?
What percentage of climate change is anthropogenic?
Well, according to the scientists who are in Paris right now, which would fill pretty much the entire space of the building in which we're in right now, and the number of deniers would still be the ones who are active.
Yeah, what's
Are
the
you
percentage, Senator?
Are you aware of a recent survey of the professional members of the American Meteorological Society? When asked the question, how much is the recent changes natural versus human cause, 52% of the membership said it was majority human cause.
Dr. Titley.
So let me move from the magnetic north to the magnetic field round the Earth, my lords. And what does my noble friend on the front bench think of the latest Swedish research by the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland that claims that it is the galactic cosmic rays that are a major effect on our weather? Their research underpins research done about 10 years ago also in Sweden, that it is the high sun activity, particularly at the moment, which is the greatest it's been for at least 1,000 years, that is causing climate change. And as a result of this, we have overestimated the amount that carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases are contributing towards our climate change. If we have done that, my lords, all our models, and the models that Baroness Brown relies on, are wrong, my lords. And we need, if we are going to tackle the problem of climate change, whether it's getting colder or whether it's getting warmer, we need to have a factual scientific base, my lords. And if some scientists are now saying that the reasons are different from what we've thought and undermines much of what has been said in this debate, then, my lords, we need to take that into account.
Thank you, Senator Angus. Good morning, Senators. And I want to thank you very much for giving us this opportunity to talk about the science behind global warming. My name is Ian Clark. I'm a professor, as I say, at the University of Ottawa of Earth Sciences. This is the first time that I've tried to teach my paleoclimate course in 10 minutes, but I'll give it my best shot. What I want to present, what I want to present today is is global temperature and CO2, the geological record. So we'll go back through time, and we'll start with the last 150 years. And this period of time is characterized by a cold spell that we refer to as the Little Ice Age, and it ended about 1900, and this was a period when glaciers advanced globally. Agriculture failures were common. The Greenland colonies failed. But it ended about 1900, and that started what we call the 20th century warming trend. And so we've had about 100 years of warming, and the characteristics of this warming trend are, it's rather bimodal. We had warming up to the 1940s, cooling again through the 50s, 60s to the mid-70s, and then a second warming trend through the 80s and 90s. If we look at CO2 during that time, CO2 was a steady baseline at about 280 ppm in the atmosphere, and during this warming trend, CO2 rose up to about 380 ppm. Today, the warming trend that we're concerned with is really just this last bit, because CO2 in the earlier part of the 20th century was really too minor, and the IPCC and most scientists agree that this was all a natural warming trend here, and that this is potentially the anthropogenic trend. Here's the global CO2 anomaly, and to put it into perspective, we're looking at about a 35% increase in CO2 derived from ice cores and then dovetailed with actual air measurements, which were started in the 50s in Hawaii. If we look at the past 50 years, 55 years, we see that through the 70s, temperatures were quite low during that cold spell, and then they start to rise through the 80s and 90s up towards the last decade. But examining the last decade shows that temperatures really have flattened, And so we haven't really seen any global warming for about the past 10 years, some say since the 1998 El Nino. And this is in stark contrast with the IPCC forecast of an increase of some 0.2 degrees per decade that should have occurred during this period. So this is quite controversial, what's going on at that time. Is this 20th century warming unusual? Well, we go back to 1,000 years before present, and we see a warm period, which we call the medieval warm period, which occurred centered on 1,000 years ago, lasted about 200 years, well documented by agricultural records. The Vikings settled in Greenland and came to Canada. So there's lots of documentation and proxy records for the medieval warm period, followed by the Little Ice Age and then 20th century warming. But during that period, we didn't see any effect of CO2. So CO2 was flat during this time, and so there's no correlation with this greenhouse gas. We go back further in time, here over the last 10,000 years, and this is the Holocene interglacial, following the past glacial period when glaciers covered Canada. And we see that here, the 20th century warming is one of a series of climate optima. There's the medieval warming period, the Roman climate optimum during the time of Christ, and then we go back further in the Holocene and we see various optima, warm periods of varying intensity and duration. So the current 20th century climate warming is really one of a series, is nothing unusual. Furthermore, throughout this period, CO2 was a relatively steady 280 ppm. So CO2 had nothing to do with these warming periods. We'll go back further in time, here looking at the record from ice cores in Antarctica, and these are very robust records of climate. And I'm reading from present day back 450,000 years. The records now go back closer to 1 million years, documenting interglacial periods. And here's our current, the Holocene interglacial. There's the last glacial period when glaciers covered Canada and many parts of Europe. And then our last interglacial, we have these series. Clearly, climate has been changing quite dramatically over this time period. And when we look at CO2, we see a very strong correlation. CO2 is increased during the interglacials, decreases during the glacial maximum period down to 180 ppm, back up into this last interglacial, again up to 280 to 300 ppm. So CO2 strongly correlated with climate, apparently. Well, we have to look more closely at this correlation, and this is where the science becomes obfuscated, particularly by Al Gore and other people promoting CO2 as a forcing agent. And here we're looking at a very detailed interface between a glacial period here at 245 to 240 and an interglacial period. So we have warming shown in red, and that warming occurs about 800 years prior to the CO2 increase. So CO2 is lagging temperature increase by about 800 years. And this has been demonstrated for all these glacial, interglacial interfaces through time. So we're always seeing a lag. CO2 is not driving climate. CO2 is not acting as a greenhouse gas over this very important period of strong climate change. Now we're going to go back over the last 500 million years of Earth history. This, I'm presenting research by Jan Weitzer, my colleague here, and this record shows a decoupling of CO2 and climate over this, what we call the Phanerozoic. And during the Phanerozoic, what Jan has shown is that we've had a series of ice houses and greenhouses. So we've had ice ages and hot houses or warm periods on a rather cyclical time scale over this 500 million year period. But when we look at the correlation with CO2, we see high CO2, and these are various models of CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere. This is a log scale, so at number 1 we're looking at a 10-fold increase of CO2 over today. And so back during our Ordovician glaciation, we had very high CO2 during the carbon. At first it comes down. This is when we created all these coal beds in North America, and CO2 went to by sequestration. Here's another Jurassic ice age, and CO2 is 5 to 10 times higher than today. So even over this time frame, we do not see a correlation with CO2. We do not see CO2 as a climate driver. But we do see this if we look at the model projections going into the future. Here I'm showing the IPCC model projections from the year 2000 over the next 100 years. And they all climb by about 2 to 3 to 4 degrees Celsius, and these are significant increases in temperatures. How do they model the greenhouse to achieve these temperatures? Well, CO2 is a very minor greenhouse gas. It's a very minor constituent of the atmosphere. It is by far a strong greenhouse gas. The strongest by far is water vapor. And so water vapor is used in these models to drive climate warming. The concept, or the model, is based on a little bit of CO2 warming, which would be insignificant, is amplified by water vapor, a 2 to 4 time water vapor feedback. And this feedback effect has never been documented. It's never been seen in the geological record. And so it remains an hypothesis that we've based all of our predictions, and this is the only reason why we're predicting global warming. Do the models work? Well, as my colleague Ross...
Can I just interject 1 second here? I apologize, sir.
No problem.
As you, I think, know, we're being broadcast on the CPAC network and also on the World Wide
I
Web.
understand.
And these overheads that you're referring to in your testimony and almost continually are not being shown, unfortunately, on the networks because they're not bilingual. And that's one of our inviolable rules here in the Senate. So,
I understand.
But I think your narrative still makes them understandable.
I have written a testimony
Yeah.
that should be published as well.
At some point, sir, you might just, again, we're not all scientists here, only one of us, and not me. You keep talking about greenhouse gases on the one hand, and then you say CO2 is a greenhouse gas, and then H2O factor. Just what? There's a colloquialism out there in the world that's become part of our regular vocabulary, greenhouse gases, that I don't think anybody really knows what they're saying when they say it.
Can I
so if you
describe
could
that?
give a definition, it'd be great.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. The planet, and these are the slides that I cut from my talk, the planet without what we call greenhouse gases, with just a transparent atmosphere of nitrogen and oxygen, would be about 32 degrees colder than today. We'd have a planet which would be unlivable, would be frozen. Thanks to one greenhouse gas, which is water vapor. And what water vapor does in the atmosphere is it absorbs the outgoing radiation. When we warm the planet with solar radiation during the day, it emits that radiation throughout the day and throughout the night. So the planet cools. If we trap that outgoing radiation, what we call long-wave radiation or infrared radiation, like what you see on the hot plates in fast food restaurants, the heat is retained in the atmosphere and warms the Earth's surface. So we retain a planet which is now 14 degrees above zero, and habitable. CO2 represents a couple percent of that greenhouse gas effect. It's a very minor greenhouse gas. Water does all the work. So when we talk about the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere and accumulating greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, and we focus on CO2, we're being deceptive, because CO2 cannot give us the warming that has been projected. So to project warming, if we feel we have to account for the past century's warming and project that into the future with CO2, we are obliged to amplify that with water vapor. So my graph with a little arrow of CO2 is making the water vapor cycle work. it's preposterous. CO2 is a very minor greenhouse gas, and we're attributing it all the power in the world to move water vapor around as it will. Preposterous. Okay,
Speed up a bit,
I'm
yeah.
closing in on the final here. So the models predict, as Ross pointed out, a hot spot, and this is the classic response of our planet, or should be, to an enhanced greenhouse effect, where we have between the latitudes of 30 north and 30 south at about 12 kilometers in the troposphere, a thumbprint of warming. This is our fingerprint, our thumbprint of greenhouse warming, according to the models, the numerical models that we're told to believe. If we look at the radiosonde measurements, these are balloon-based temperature readings, there is no hot spot. In fact, we have cooling. So we might suggest that the models are incorrect. And then we can ask, well, what do the people who run these models say? And here's what they say. And these are the famous leaked emails, which we get an insight to the thinking of the people who are warning us about catastrophic global warming. Thorne from the Met Office at the Climate Research Unit says, observations do not show rising temperatures throughout the tropical troposphere. This is downright dangerous. We need to communicate the uncertainty and be honest. Phil Jones, who keeps the temperature records, hopefully we can find time to discuss this. Phil Jones responds, the basic problem is that all models are wrong. There's not enough middle and low-level clouds, i.e. they cannot model water vapor and cloud formation. And then Wilson pipes in, well, what if climate change appears just to be mainly a multi-decadal natural fluctuation? They'll kill us probably. These people have great uncertainty in their work, but we don't see that when they present it in the IPCC documents. So what is driving global warming? Well, we have to look at the sun. And we have, unlike CO2, very good correlations between solar activity, various measures of solar activity, and temperature. Here again in the Arctic, where Arctic temperatures, and there's all our melting in the Arctic, correlating with solar activity, but not with CO2. And I'll show one last bit of research done by Solanki, published in Nature, where he points out that during the recent decades, the sun's activity has been greater compared to the last 11,000 years. And here's his graph showing a proxy of solar activity over 11,000 years, and it has peaked in the past 20th century when we see this 20th century warming. Well, let's zero in on that last little bit. And here's the last 1,000 years. And here's a bona fide temperature record from the Greenland ice core, a very robust temperature record in blue. And it correlates very well with our solar activity. So we have a reason that our climate is warming. It's not CO2. And if I can just summarize, we find that there's no geological evidence that CO2 has behaved in the past as a significant forcing mechanism. CO2 remains at the lowest level today, range than observed over geological time. I'd like to add that it's more than a benign gas. It's an essential nutrient for life, with only beneficial effects. And our efforts to limit the use of fossil, carbon-based energy has solved no environmental problems, yet has created many more, including the accelerated production of ethanol and the conversion of tropical rainforest to tropical palm oil production. And my feeling is that it's time that we turn our attention to real and tangible environmental problems. And thank you very much.
Economic growth is, of course, an inevitable corollary of a growing population and is essential to improve standards of living. But without careful coordination, unrestrained economic growth poses further threats to our environment. This was a major subject of discussion at the conference in Rio de Janeiro on the environment 2 years ago. The focus then was on sustainable growth and global development. It was pointed out at the conference that growth is most efficiently managed by the private sector, but regulation of the process by national governments and international bodies is also needed. And once again, the United Nations should certainly be among the catalysts and coordinators of this process.
Hello, America. I'm Mark Levin. This is Life, Liberty, and Levin. Welcome.
Nice to see you.
It's a great honor to see you, Patrick Michaels, doctor, expert on all things climate and environment as far as I'm concerned. A little bit of your background. You're the director of the Center for Study of Science at the Cato Institute. You hold an A, B, and SM. You hold those degrees in biology, sciences, and plant ecology from the University of Chicago. Pretty good school. PhD in ecological climatology from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, 1979. You're past president of the American Association of State Climatologists. You were program chairman for the Committee on Applied Climatology of the American Meteorological Society. Say that fast 5 times.
Yeah.
You were a research professor of environmental sciences at the University of Virginia for 30 years, and I'm giving an extensive, background that you have. I'm giving that to the public, so they know you really know what you're talking about. And you're a contributing author and a reviewer of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. All right, let's get started. Climate change, global warming, global cooling, we've heard it all. What's going on out there?
Well, the surface temperature of the planet is warmer than it was 100 years ago, about 9/10 of a degree Celsius.
9/10 of a degree Celsius.
That's all.
Is that a lot?
No, it's not a lot. There are 2 periods of warming, one in the early 20th century that could not have been caused by human beings because we hadn't put enough CO2 in the air, and one in the later part of the 20th century that either slows down or ends, depending upon whose data you use, somewhere in the late 1990s, only to resume with the big El Nino that covered the news over the last couple of years. So that means that probably about half, maybe half, of that 9/10 of a degree might be caused by greenhouse gases. Because when the planet warmed beginning in 1976, the temperature of the stratosphere started to drop. And that's a prediction of greenhouse theory that's not intuitive. The great philosopher of science, Karl Popper, said, if you can meet a difficult prediction with your theory, you can continue to entertain your theory. So the theory's right, but the application of it is wrong. It is nowhere near as warm as it's supposed to be. The computer models are making systematic, dramatic errors over the entire tropics, which is 40% of the Earth, and it's where all our moisture comes from, or almost all of it.
Let me stop you there.
Yeah.
Who does these computer models?
Governments. There are 32 families of computer models that are used by the United Nations, each government-sponsored, and all of them are predicting far, far too much warming. The disparity between what's been predicted to happen, which looks like this, and what is happening continues to grow.
We know that for a fact.
Yeah, because you can just look at the weather balloon temperatures, you can look at the satellite temperatures, you can look at something called the reanalysis data. They all behave in concert. So they're showing the same thing, and the same thing is a lot different than this thing. However, we need to call the special counsel.
Special counsel?
Yes, because one model works. And you know what it is? It's the Russian model.
So let me get this. So all the government models are like this?
Yeah.
The Russian model is like this?
Yeah. The Russian model has the least warming in it.
And the Russian model is the least warming, and the Russian model pretty much follows reality.
Yeah.
What's been tested over a few decades.
Yeah, correct. You know, if we were rational about this, think about the daily weather forecast. You watch the Weather Channel, they go, oh, this model says that, that model says that. We think this one's working the best, so we're going to rely on that. Well, for climate forecast, we should be using the Russian model, but we're not. We use this big spate of all the other models that have this warming in them that's not occurring.
Why are all these other government models, 31 of them, I guess,
Yeah.
wrong? And why do they all go in the same direction? Up.
Because they are what is called parameterized. They're all parameterized. Can I translate parameterized into English? Fudged.
Okay.
The don't get the right answer, don't know the right answer for certain phenomena. So we essentially put in code steps that give us what we think it should be. And the systematic error that was made was the models were tuned, as it said, tuned to simulate the warming of the early 20th century. Began in 1910, ended in 1945, about 0.45 degrees Celsius. Mark, that could not have been caused by carbon dioxide.
Because there wasn't enough.
That we hadn't put enough in. The background carbon dioxide concentration is 280 parts per million. When the first warming started, it was 298 parts per million. If the atmosphere is that sensitive to an 18 ppm change in CO2, we wouldn't be talking about this right now, and we'd be sweating bullets.
So what you're saying is man-made carbon dioxide earlier, the last century, could not have produced.
The early 20th century.
Early 20th century could not have produced this heat. So what did? Do we know?
No. And, you know, the three most important words in life may not be I love you. It might be I don't know. I don't think anybody really knows what kicked off that warming. There's lots of theories. One is that it was the final escape from a cold period, multi-century period known as the Little Ice Age. That's a plausibility, but why did it happen then? But we just don't really have a good explanation for that. But because we forced the computer models to say, aha, human influence, CO2 and other stuff, we made the models too sensitive. And so that's why when you get to the late 20th century, all of a sudden they're warming up like crazy, and the reality's down here. It was guaranteed to happen. This was revealed in Science magazine in late 2016. And there was a paper that was published by a French climate modeler called The Art and Science of Climate Model Tuning. And in it, he speaks of parameterizing, we could say fudging, the models to give his words an anticipated acceptable range of results. So it's the scientist, not the science, that's determining how much it's going to warm. A lot of people don't know this, but it happens to be true. And, you know, we could speculate as to why that paper was published right before the 2016 election. I wouldn't want to impute causation, but gee, if...
But I want to ask you about causation.
Sure.
You have 31 governments.
No, the 31 different models. Some of them.
All right, 31 different models, but multiple governments.
Right.
Who are fudging the numbers.
They're not fudging them.
They're fudging the models.
Parameterizing.
Okay, well, you use the word fudging. Does our EPA do that? Does NASA do that? Who does that for us?
Aha. Good question, Mark. Because the EPA was told by the Supreme Court in 2007 that if it found that carbon dioxide endangered human health and welfare, that it had the power to regulate it under the Clean Air Act.
This is the Massachusetts
That's Mass v. EPA. Well, they produced an endangerment finding, 2009. And the endangerment finding for its prospective climate is 100%. I didn't say 90%. I said 100% based on those models. So if you can demonstrate that those models systematically are not working, you can take down the endangerment finding. And that would be the basis for all those policies that came out of the Obama administration.
Which would mean you don't get to regulate
Absolutely.
carbon dioxide.
Absolutely. The endangerment finding is the heart of the matter. And to give you an idea how gung-ho the Obama administration was on this issue, if you listen to his first inaugural speech, January 20th, 2009, it's the second substantive paragraph of the speech is about global warming after health care. 90 days after he finished that speech, his EPA produced a preliminary finding of endangerment from carbon dioxide. They were working on this before he was president. Bureaucrats can't work that fast. And then the final finding was made in December for the climate conference in Copenhagen that was supposed to produce another global warming
So you're
agreement.
telling us that we have a massive bit of public policy that has an enormous effect on society.
Absolutely.
That's built on, I'll use my word, phony models.
It's built on a house of cards. The models really don't work. And if I could really be arcane, I can explain the mechanism as to why they don't work.
As long as I understand it.
The models systematically predict that as you go up in the atmosphere in the tropics, which are 40% of the Earth, that the temperature should rise dramatically as you go further up in the atmosphere. So when you get to the level of the jet stream, the computer models are predicting 7 times. I didn't say 7/10 of a degree. I said 7 times more warming than is being observed. Well, why is that important? Why am I boring you with that? Because it's the vertical distribution of temperature that determines upward motion, which means it determines precipitation. And guess what? Almost all the atmospheric moisture that we have around us today in humid Washington, D.C., that comes from the tropics. So if you get that vertical motion wrong, down there, you get all the subsequent variables wrong. It's a fantastic systematic error. And again, that along with the difference between the surface temperatures, or rather the lower atmospheric temperatures and what's being observed, that's sufficient to kill the endangerment finding.
Okay, so to the average pedestrian like me, if you get that wrong, what does that mean? You get all the weather models wrong?
You get the subsequent weather wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, that's why, if you look at all these families of models, they predict radically different changes in precipitation from model to model. Well, probably because they got the precipitation initialization out of the tropics wrong. Precipitation's important. I offer you Wilmington, North Carolina as an example. The precipitation is important coming from the tropics. Get that wrong, and you get that wrong.
Is weather getting worse?
No. I love that question because what do you really want to look at? Roger Pilkey Jr. at University of Colorado does this. Yes, there's more damage from weather because there's more stuff and people and property in the way of weather. So what you really want to look at are weather damages as a percent of GDP. And when you look at it that way, there's nothing whatsoever. Oh, I'm sure hurricanes are getting worse. I heard that on every legacy network during Florence and Harvey and all that stuff. Well, the fact of the matter is there's a guy by the name of Ryan Maui who's just a hotshot young tropical meteorologist. He's also an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, and he tracks the energy in these tropical cyclones since we got global records that begin in 1970. And you would think there would be some relationship between that integrated energy and global warming. After all, it's only logical. Vice President Gore says that must be the case. It's not. There's no relationship whatsoever between the accumulated cyclone energy and the surface temperature of the Earth. It's just not there. Now, wait a minute. Why does our government say this? They said it in their last report called Global Climate Change Impacts in the United States. They said, oh, there's been a significant increase in hurricane power in the Atlantic Ocean from like 1970 to 2009 or something like that, 1980 to 2009. Well, wait a minute. Why'd you stop in 2009? It's a 2014 report. Because if you take the data after 2009, the increase goes away and it goes back to where it was. Or why did you start in the mid-1970s? Because we have records that are really good back to 1920. And if you look 1920 to 1950, you see an increase that is exactly the same as the one that occurred.
So the information they're providing us
is
skewed. Incomplete. It's skewed.
It's skewed. They're cherry picking.
Uh-huh. And here we rely on the climatologists, the meteorologists, and they become hyper-political. And I want to get back to that as soon as we return. Don't forget, ladies and gentlemen, you can watch Levin TV almost every weeknight by going to crtv.com/mark, crtv.com/mark and sign up there, or give us a call at 844-LEVIN-TV, 844-LEVIN-TV.